Okay, hello again, and we're going to continue our conversation on basic science, analog and digital audio, but there's other subjects that are discussed in this as well. Let's see if we can get to the frame. There we go. Some of this comes from Digital Radio Production by Donald Conley, third edition. Waveland Press, and you can read more about that book in your syllabus. It's a digital world, so we're going to get into talking about digital audio, and also we'll be comparing that to analog or traditional type of audio production as we go along here. Thomas Edison, amazing person, invented the first recording system, which was an analog system. We're going to explain that in a minute. And what he invented basically was the phonograph, but also the means to record music or anything else that could be played on a phonograph. So we have a lot to thank Edison for, and one of those things is basically recording technology. Analog sound relies on an analogous relationship between the original sound wave and its electrical representation. Digital audio does not. So this is a little hard to explain, but basically traditional recording is continuous and tries to replicate the original sound wave as closely as possible. Now that sounds like what you would want to do. Digital is a matter of sampling, and you're not really replicating the original sound wave so much as you are taking little samples from it and then reconstructing those. Okay, so let's look at analog definition, then I'm going to show you a video on analog versus digital. So analog, again, this is, so when you think analog, think of the reel-to-reel tape recorders and things of that nature, which may not even be familiar to you, but more traditional type recording. And of course, a lot of you now are familiar with LPs, and those would be a representation of analog technology. So the definition of analog relating to being a mechanism or device in which information is represented by continuously variable physical quantity. So that word continuous is an important word there, whereas digital is not continuous. Okay, now let's look at a video here on analog versus digital.
After my DVT blood clot, I wondered, could another come around the corner, or could it play out different?
For a while now, the word digital has been slapped on so many things that it's sort of become a marketing buzzword to convince people that something is high tech or better in some way. Of course, most modern electronics are digital by definition as opposed to analog. But what do these terms even mean, and is digital necessarily even better? For a long time, most consumer electronics like televisions and cassette decks worked by using analog signals, which you can think of as being similar to one of those wall clocks with a perpetually moving second hand. Just as the second hand continuously moves to represent the time, analog signals use some type of thing that's constantly changing to represent data. For example, both AM radio and old school broadcast TV use a signal with a continuously variable wave height or amplitude to represent sounds or visuals. These sorts of analog waves can be decoded or demodulated fairly easily with diodes that can relay actual data to a screen or a speaker.
By the way, I'll just stop for a second. Broadcast television now is digital. Now, AM and FM radio continue, and there are digital forms of broadcasting for radio as well, but the old AM and FM broadcasting still continues. But television now, broadcast television over the air, is all digital.
But as any child of the 1980s who grew up watching rabbit ears connected TVs or dubbing cassette tapes knows, a massive drawback to analog tech is the possibility of interference. The variations in waves that encode analog data are so small that interference can easily disrupt the analog waveforms and cause snow on your TV, static on your radio, or even problems with monitors that use older VGA cables, which are actually analog despite most other modern computer components being digital. Digital technology attempts to solve this problem by encoding and transmitting data as clear-cut discrete units, namely ones and zeros, instead of always changing waveforms that are super sensitive to interference. These ones and zeros are actually just representations of electrical signals being on or off. When you view it on a square wave, that's either up or down. These positions are easy representations since any piece of a square wave can only be read in one of two states, on or off, up or down. They aren't nearly as vulnerable to interference, making digital transmission normally a heck of a lot more reliable across longer distances, which is why the length of speaker wire in your home theater matters, but the length of a digital HDMI cable usually doesn't, at least not for resisting interference. And since digital data is stored as an exact finite set of ones and zeros, it can be perfectly replicated anytime you need to make a copy, unlike analog recordings that degrade over time due to the difficulty in duplicating an analog wave at every single point. This is the reason that an MP3 copied to 1 million iPods will sound the same on every one, but a cassette tapes that are copied a whole bunch will eventually sound like garbage after you dub them enough times.
Okay, we'll pause that there. It's a pretty good discussion. It's a complicated subject, but that's a pretty good discussion of analog versus digital. We will work entirely in the digital realm in everything we do, but it's useful to understand the concept of analog recording. So again, analog sound is continuous, and digital relies on sampling of the original sound wave, sampling. And so let's have and you've already seen a little bit about the thing about the zeros and ones, but that's not exactly sampling. So let's look at a video here on the idea of sampling.
Hello and welcome to Production Bites. I'm your host, Veronova, and today I'm going to be covering digital audio and how it works. In this tutorial I'm going to cover the very basics, and in the next video I'm going to cover some more of the advanced principles of digital audio. So you're all familiar with a waveform hopefully, but how do we go from a sound wave, such as a sine wave, to a digital recording which displays a sine wave? Well, this is done through sampling. And when I say sampling, I'm not referring to taking sections of audio from other people's music and using them in your own, but instead taking regular measurements of the waveform throughout its cycle. So when a sound is converted to digital audio, regular measurements are taken of the waveform's amplitude over time. The number of measurements taken per second is known as the sampling rate, and typically this is 44,100 times per second, and is represented in hertz, which is a scientific term meaning cycles per second. 44,100 samples or measurements per second is 44.1 kilohertz audio. There are also plenty of other sampling rates available depending on your hardware and software setup, but 44.1 kilohertz audio is the most common and is used on pretty much every consumer format such as CD, MP3, AAC, and FLAC audio. So that's how the sound wave amplitude is stored over time. But how do we represent the amplitudes of each analog sample digitally?
We're going to come to this subject of bit depth soon, but I think you got a pretty good representation there of digital recording and sampling in particular. And again, you saw the amplitude represented, and you saw the sine wave represented, which we've talked about before. That sampling rate of 44,100 samples per second. We're going to come back to that. That's going to become very familiar because that is the standard sampling rate at which we will record. And if that is not the default position on Adobe Audition, which is what we use for recording, then you can set it to 44,100. It may be set at 48,000. If you were to leave it at that, it really wouldn't do any harm. But again, the standard sampling rate It's 44,100, which is what he told you. All of this is possible because of integrated circuits, microchips. And the transistor came along in 1947, and what you see represented here is something called a transistor radio. And we still have portable battery-operated radios that pick up AM and FM broadcasting. So they more or less still are with us. I don't know that they use transistors in the way that the old transistor radios did. I'm sure they don't. But the transistor was a great advance in that it allowed for miniaturization. And then from the transistor, things got smaller and smaller, and we got the microchips that exist today in your cell phone, in your smartphone, in almost any other form of electronics that you use, laptops. So the development of the transistor in 1947 made digital technology using ultimately integrated circuits or microchips possible. Just show you a little bit of this is more out of nostalgia than anything else, a video of a transistor radio. These were, ask your grandparents about transistor radios, probably not your parents so much, but these were, every teenager basically had one of these in the 50s and 60s, and you would walk around with a transistor radio in the same way that you probably walk around today with your smartphone listening to MP3s that you have downloaded. But that miniaturization was remarkable because, again, he's holding that in his hand. It's very easy for him to carry that. And radios prior to transistors were fairly large, some of them quite large, but certainly the size of something that you would have to put on a shelf, and you would have to plug it into the wall, and you couldn't carry it around with you. So the transistor radio was a great advance, and from the transistor radio ultimately developed things like handheld calculators, and finally, up to this point, the smartphones that you're familiar with. So we've come a long way. And then Sony released the first compact disc CD player, 1982, another major advance. Analog to digital conversion is done by sampling, which we've already discussed. We've already seen that video. The converter reads samples of the analog signal and then assigns a binary number to each sample. This is called quantization. Don't worry too much about that. But this is where we get into the sampling rate. There's something called the Nyquist theorem, that the sampling must be twice the highest frequency we are recording or playing back, which is related to hearing range, and this all gets quite complicated. Don't worry too much if this is somewhat confusing. But the Nyquist theorem says the sampling must be twice the highest frequency we are recording or playing back. Now, this is related to our ability to hear at certain frequencies. Remember, we talked about the fact that humans can hear up to about 20,000 hertz. So the standard sampling rate, which we were talking about a few minutes ago, is 44,100 hertz. That's 44,100 samples per second. And that's about, if you look at that, that's about twice the rate of our hearing. 20,000 hertz, 44,000 hertz. So it's twice the highest frequency at which we are recording or playing back, or we might say our hearing range. And that is the reason why that standard sampling rate is set at 44,100. The higher the sampling rate, the more accurate the sound. Let's see if we can see an example of that here. Okay, so here the sampling rate is 44,100 hertz, which is the standard rate, Bit depth is 32 bits. We're going to be talking about that here in a few minutes. So you can hear this, what this sounds like at the standard sampling rate of 44,100 hertz. And then we'll hear it at a lower sampling rate. This is at 22,000, sampling rate of about 22,000. So it's about half of what we were at before. And it's not that noticeable to me, but it's somewhat noticeable. And let's say I believe it goes to a lower sampling rate yet. Yeah, this is about 11,000. And now you can definitely hear the difference there between this and the 44,000. It's easy to hear this now. The bit rate remains the same. We'll talk about bit depth here in a minute, but you can hear the difference in 44,000, a sampling rate of about 44,000 and a sampling rate of about 11,000 samples per second. Bit depth, let's look at this concept. We'll start in the middle of this video.
You can't fake the goodness of real strawberries. The crunch of real almonds.
This is the video we were looking at before. We're just going to pick it up where he started to talk about bit depth. I believe this is it right here.
Sample digitally. Each sample is stored as digitally. Each sample is stored. But how do we represent the amplitudes of each analog sample digitally? Each sample is stored as digital data, which means it's stored as a binary value, and the number of variations in a single binary value, or bit, is 2. A bit can be either 0 or 1. Obviously, a sound wave is not either 0 or 1, so typically 16 bits are used to store each sample's amplitude to give a greater resolution between these 2 points. This is known as bit depth, and 24 and 32-bit bit depths are also used in professional audio to give extra resolution to maintain quality through the production process, but 16-bit is the consumer standard. Something useful to know is the actual resolution that 16, 24 or 32-bit audio provides, and you can work this out using some fairly simple maths, just by knowing the bit depth. 2 possible binary values per bit to the power of the number of bits per sample will give you the resolution available for the amplitude of the audio. So 16-bit audio would be 2 to the power of 16, which is 65,536 possible amplitudes. And 24-bit would be 2 to the power of 24, which is a big number.
So we'll pause that there, but the greater the bit depth, then the more accurate the sound. Okay, so again, we've talked about the digital system being a binary system. Morse code, going back to Morse code. If you were in certainly the Studies in Electronic Communication class, MMJ-221, I know we talk about the telegraph, and we talk about Morse code as the beginning of electronic communication way back in the 1840s. And basically that was a binary system. Sending a telegraph message was sending zeros and ones, on and off, an electrical impulse or not an electrical impulse. So that's the beginning of a digital system, of a binary system. And what are called digital words are assigned to each sample. So I liken this to a children's book versus novels for adults. If you have a children's book and you're limited in both the number of words that you can use and the complexity of the words, you can only convey a certain amount of information. So run, spot, run, see Jane jump, those kinds of things in a child's reader. So you're very limited. But if you have War and Peace or Moby Dick, where you're basically unlimited in the number of words you can use and the vocabulary that you can use. You can convey much more complicated, complex ideas. So it's somewhat like that. So a 2-bit system allows, which we don't use for anything significant in electronics or sound production. A 2-bit system would allow for 4 digital so-called words. So your combinations are, as you see them, 1 and 1, 1 and 0, 0 and 1, 0 and 0. And a 4-bit system would allow for 16 binary words, still very crude, for reproducing sound. And here, this is a representation of digital technology, digital recording. 8-bit systems would then produce something like telephone line quality. So you understand when you're talking to someone on the telephone, whether it's a cell phone or a regular phone, that you can understand what they're saying, but the quality is not, certainly not recording studio quality, as we say, broadcast quality. Then the 16-bit system, as he told you in the video, is the standard for recording CDs, and this allows for over 65,000 words, digital words, as he showed you, 16 to the 4th power. So with 65,000 digital words, now we get into a recording, the quality of recording that would be comparable to Moby Dick or War and Peace, okay? So that we can convey a lot of information and a lot of quality information that way. And then now Adobe Audition, which you will be using, allows up to a 96,000 hertz sampling rate and 32-bit words. So it would be interesting to see how much of a difference if we used 96,000 as the sampling rate, 96,000 samples per second, and a 32-bit system, how much better it would sound. And my guess is to most of us, our ears would not hear that great of a difference. I don't want to talk too much about phase, the difference in time as two sound waves as they travel from one place to another. This has to do a lot with live recording. We're not going to do much in the way of live recording. Now, some of you might decide to do this, but waves in phase reinforce one another and amplitude is increased. If they are not in phase, then they weaken each other and amplitude is decreased. So this has to do with the traveling of sound from one point to another point. You see the first illustration is for sound that is in phase, and then this would be a representation of sound that is out of phase. And what we want the sound arriving from different locations to different microphones to basically arrive at the same time. So it gets, this is an issue that's important in recording live music, very much so. If it's enough out of phase, the waves may nearly be inaudible. So it can be a very big problem. So there's a couple of different videos here. I'm just going to show you part of this first one.
One of the sure ways for things to sound bad is a result of a phenomenon known as phase cancellation. It's important to understand how phase cancellation happens and how to avoid it. One of the most important and overlooked aspects of recording is to make sure that all the mics are in phase if more than one is to be used at the same time. The reason is because with only a single out-of-phase mic, a multi-mic'd instrument like a drum kit will just never sound right, and if not corrected, never be able to be fixed. So just what is phase anyway? Without getting into an intense technical explanation, it just means that the outputs of all microphones used on the session are pushing and pulling together as one. If one mic is pushing while another is pulling, they cancel each other out at certain frequencies. When mic number 1 signal peaks, mic number 2 signal valleys. They cancel each other out at that frequency, and the result is a very weak sounding signal when mixed together. Here, both mics are pushing and pulling together. Their signal peaks happen at the same time as does their valleys. As a result, their signals reinforce one another.
Well, we'll pause it at that point. As I say, this is not going to be that important of a concept necessarily. It could be, depending on what you might decide to do. But and if it becomes an issue, then we'll talk more about it. But generally speaking, this is not that much of an issue if we're working in a production studio, which is how most of our work would take place. All right, that'll end this second part of this discussion of the basics of sound. And thanks, and we'll see you next time.